Imagine a gas station, not a busy one, a quiet one, the kind you drive past without thinking twice, pumps standing in a row, a fluorescent sign, maybe a small shop inside selling coffee and cigarettes, utterly ordinary, utterly forgettable. Now imagine that same gas station, with a line stretching around the block, cars queued up in the heat, engines idling, drivers checking their phones, checking the clock, checking the line again. And then imagine a man in a uniform walking down that line, not to help anyone, but to hand out slips of paper, coupons, one per person. And on each coupon, a number, 20. 20 liters. That's your allocation, that's all you get. When it's gone, it's gone. Come back tomorrow, maybe. The sign by the pump doesn't say closed, it says something colder than that. It says suspended. Now ask yourself, where in the world, in June of 2026, does that scene play out not at one gas station, not in one city, but across an entire peninsula, and then spread quietly to 25 regions of one of the largest countries on Earth? That scene is not a hypothetical. It is happening right now in Russian-occupied Crimea, and it is beginning to replicate itself across Russia in ways that the Kremlin is struggling to explain away. And here is why it matters, because it is tempting to look at a gas station coupon and think inconvenience, think a logistical hiccup, think manageable. But a coupon is never just a coupon. A coupon is a government's admission that the market has failed to deliver something people need. It is a signal that the normal mechanisms of supply and distribution have broken down badly enough that the state must step in and ration what remains. The last time Russia used wartime fuel coupons on this scale was during the Soviet era. That context should tell you something, not everything, but something. What we are watching in Crimea, and increasingly across Russia's southern and central regions, is the convergence of two separate pressure campaigns that Ukraine has been running for more than 2 years. One targets the top of the supply chain, the refineries, the processing facilities, the places where crude oil becomes the fuel that armies and civilians actually use. The other targets the bottom, the roads, the rail lines, the depots, the trucks that carry finished fuel to the people who need it. When both campaigns succeed simultaneously in the same geography, you do not get a shortage, you get a crisis. And that is precisely what June 2026 looks like in Crimea. Today is June 14th, 2026. And in the last 72 hours, the tempo of this story has not slowed, it has tightened. Just last night, Ukraine's general staff confirmed a massive strike on an oil preparation, processing, and pumping facility near Kotovo in the Volgograd region. The fires that followed were large enough to be tracked by NASA satellite systems. The night before that, Ukrainian forces struck the Grushevaya Balka oil depot near Novorossiysk, one of the largest storage complexes in Russia's entire Black Sea export chain, with tank capacity exceeding 1.2 million cubic meters. 2 tanks at that facility were confirmed burning as of June 8th. And the night before that, drones hit the Krasny Yar pumping station in Volgograd and a maritime oil terminal in Feodosia on the Crimean coast. This is not a single strike. This is a campaign running on a near-nightly rhythm, targeting the infrastructure that Russia depends on to move energy from the ground to the front line. This is Professor Zhang. If you find this kind of analysis useful, the economics, the logistics, the war underneath the war, then subscribe. I do not hype, I do not guess. I try to tell you what the evidence actually shows. Let us follow the money. Or in this case, let us follow the fuel, because right now in Russia, that is the same thing. Start at the beginning of the supply chain. Crude oil comes out of the ground, travels to a refinery, gets processed into usable products, gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, and those products then move through pipelines, by rail and by road to the people and machines that consume them. Ukraine has been attacking this chain at multiple points for over 2 years, but 2026 has been different in scale and in consequence. In May 2026 alone, Ukraine's Air Force struck Russian refineries 15. The cumulative effect of those strikes and of the strikes that preceded them stretching back through 2024 and 2025 is now showing up in the production numbers in a way that can no longer be managed quietly. According to Bloomberg and OilX data released on June 1st, Russian refineries processed just 4.58 million barrels of oil per day in May. That is a 17-year low. It is 14.4% less than Russia was refining at the start of this year. To find a month when Russian refinery output was this low, you have to go back to October 2009. Russia's own Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak confirmed this at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He said, and I am quoting carefully here, "Currently, Russia's oil production is indeed lower compared to the beginning of 2026. We have a number of refineries under unscheduled repairs." Unscheduled repairs. That is the diplomatic phrasing for drones hit them and we are trying to fix them. Novak added that Russia is maximizing its export infrastructure. We will come back to what that actually means in a moment because it contains a paradox that is important to understand. So that is the top of the chain. Less refining capacity means less finished fuel entering the Russian domestic system. But now follow the fuel that does get refined and does get shipped south toward Crimea, because that is where the second pressure campaign takes hold. The R-280 highway? Russia calls it the Novorossiya Route, the New Russia Road. It is the land corridor connecting mainland Russia to occupied Crimea, running through Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. Before this spring, it was one of the most important roads in Russia's military logistics network, handling roughly 11,000 vehicles per day. Of those, approximately 3,800 were military cargo trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, equipment carriers moving south to supply the Crimean Peninsula and the southern front. In late May, something changed on that road. Ukrainian drone operators began hunting it systematically around the clock. By late May, the highway had become, in the words of reporting from that period, effectively closed to civilian traffic, with dozens of burned-out Russian trucks and fuel tankers lining the road. Dozens, not one or two, dozens of hulks, distributed along the length of the corridor as drone operators hunted convoys that tried to move by day and by night. The effect on military traffic was quantified by Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Brovdy, who on June 11th reported that military transport volumes on the R-280 had dropped by 71% over the prior 2 weeks. A road that once carried roughly 3,800 military cargo trucks per day was, by that measure, moving fewer than 1,100. And on June 6th, an intercepted Russian military combat order published by Brovdy and dated that same day showed Russian commanders formally acknowledging that Ukraine now held fire control over both the Novorossiya and the Tavrida highways, and ordering a complete halt to military use of both routes beginning June 7th. Read that again. The Russian military issued an internal order telling its own forces to stop using the main land corridors into Crimea, not because of weather, not because of maintenance, because Ukrainian drones had made those roads too dangerous for military logistics convoys to survive on. Then, on June 11th, Ukraine's defense forces disabled the last intact bridge supporting military logistics out of occupied Crimea near Armyansk. Other crossings, Chonhar-Henichesk, had already been struck. The Kerch Bridge, which was Russia's great infrastructure achievement of 2018 and was meant to solve Crimea's supply fragility forever, has been repeatedly damaged and heavily restricted since 2022. The peninsula that was always logistically vulnerable had now, in the span of about 3 weeks, lost its land corridor, lost its bridge crossings, and lost its rail junction at Dzhankoy to a drone strike on June 2nd. This is not a siege in the traditional sense. Ukraine does not surround Crimea with troops, but the functional outcome, a peninsula struggling to receive fuel, food, and military supplies at the rate it requires, is beginning to rhyme with one. The fuel crisis in Crimea did not arrive slowly. It arrived in a sequence that is worth walking through carefully because the speed of it matters. May 22nd, TA's, the largest gas station chain in Crimea, with 115 stations, launches an emergency voucher system as a cap against panic buying. May 23rd, Reuters reports rationing in Sevastopol, 20 liters per person per day for A95 petrol. May 31st, gasoline across the entire peninsula shifts to coupon-only sales. Sevastopol announces a temporary suspension of all fuel sales except for emergency services. June 4th, Crimea Governor Sergei Aksyonov announces the complete suspension of cash gasoline sales. No coupons will be reissued in the near future. License plates are now being tracked at every pump to enforce the 20-liter limit. June 12th, of more than 100 stations in the TES chain in Sevastopol, only 9 have resumed unrestricted sales. Rationing continues everywhere else. Kremlin-backed authorities warn the shortage will last at least another month. That is 22 days from emergency vouchers to cash sales suspended entirely. The escalation curve here is steep, and it did not stop at Crimea's borders. By early June, gas stations in Moscow and the Moscow region introduced limits, no more than 60 liters of gasoline and 100 liters of diesel per customer at ORTK network stations. Rosneft in Belgorod banned filling portable containers with A92 gasoline, framed as a safety measure. Occupied Luhansk imposed a 20-liter per person limit, and by June 12th, gasoline shortages were being reported at filling stations in at least 25 Russian regions. 25. The Russian government's response to all of this has been telling. Since April 1st, Russia has had a gasoline export ban in effect. In early June, the government extended that logic and introduced a ban on aviation fuel exports as well, running until November 30th, 2026. When a government that earns enormous revenues from energy exports starts banning the export of those products, it is because it cannot afford to sell them abroad when domestic demand is going unmet. Export bans are an admission of scarcity at home, and then there is the wholesale price signal. With less gasoline on the domestic market, wholesale prices have risen 26% since the beginning of 2026. That number does not stay on the wholesale market. It moves downstream into retail prices, into the cost of every product that gets trucked somewhere in Russia, which is to say, into the cost of almost everything. I want to be honest about what I do not know here, because this story has a complication that is significant and that you deserve to hear clearly. Here is the paradox. While Russia's domestic fuel situation deteriorates, its crude oil export volumes have actually been at a wartime high. Because damaged refineries cannot process crude domestically, more unprocessed crude is available for export. Average crude exports since the start of 2026 have reached 3.46 million barrels per day, approximately 120,000 barrels per day higher than 2025 levels and above every prior post-invasion annual average. Russia is, in a strange and uncomfortable sense, exporting its way through the crisis in Crimea. This matters. It means the fuel shortage in Crimea and across 25 Russian regions is at this stage primarily a domestic distribution problem, not a revenue collapse. Russia is still selling oil. It is still earning foreign currency. The crisis is real, but anyone telling you that Russia's economy is about to fall apart tomorrow is getting ahead of the evidence. What the evidence does show is a system under increasing stress. Deputy PM Novak himself said, Russia is maximizing its export infrastructure, but the Western port crude export numbers tell a more complicated story. Exports from Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Novorossiysk are expected to drop to roughly 1.7 million barrels per day in June, down from 2.5 million in May. That is a 32% single-month decline from those ports. Some of that crude is being rerouted internally. Some export infrastructure is itself being damaged or disrupted. The total picture is one of a system being reshuffled under fire, not one that is running smoothly. There is also a fiscal dimension to this that compounds everything. Russia's budget deficit for the first 3 months of 2026 alone reached 4.58 trillion rubles, already exceeding the full-year planned deficit of 3.79 trillion rubles. And oil and gas revenues fell 45% year-on-year in Q1. The mechanism here is not subtle. Fewer refined products sold domestically means either subsidized prices or civil unrest. Export bans mean less hard currency. Damaged refineries mean crude that should be converted to higher-value products is instead sold as raw crude at lower margins. A single government source cited by Reuters has suggested the 2026 budget deficit could reach nearly 3 times the planned figure, somewhere between 3.5 and 4.4% of GDP. I will flag that as a projection from a single source, not a confirmed outcome. But the Q1 numbers are confirmed. And the trajectory they describe is not a comfortable one for a government that is simultaneously funding the most expensive military operation in its post-Soviet history. This is where the fuel crisis and the fiscal crisis converge. Russia is being asked to choose, with finite and diminishing resources, how to allocate fuel between 3 competing demands: the civilian population, which needs it to function, the military, which needs it to fight, and the export market, which needs it to fund the war. Every barrel diverted to ease the domestic shortage is a barrel not sold. Every export ban tightens the budget. Every export sale, meanwhile, means another region running short. There is no clean answer to that trilemma. Russia is managing it. That is not nothing, but managing a trilemma under sustained attack is not the same as resolving it. I also want to acknowledge something that Russian officials are not entirely wrong about, even if their framing serves an obvious purpose. When Sevastopol Governor Mikhail Razvozhayev said in late May that the difficulties were linked to the need to strengthen security measures and optimize the logistics routes, he was beneath the bureaucratic language describing something real. Some portion of the early rationing in Crimea was aimed at preventing hoarding panic rather than addressing a structural physical shortage. Coupon systems and purchase limits can be as much about managing consumer behavior, stopping people from filling their garages with jerry cans, as they are about a genuine absence of fuel in the system. Russia's energy ministry, for its part, insisted that domestic supply remains stable and under control. The Kremlin insisted there are no risks of nationwide shortages. I do not take those statements at face value given the simultaneous export bans and rationing systems. But I also do not think the full story is Russia is out of fuel. The more accurate picture is Russia is experiencing sustained compounding stress in its fuel distribution system, with the most acute symptoms in Crimea, where multiple vectors of attack have converged at once. Russia has shown considerable resilience over the last 4 years. It has rerouted supply chains before. It has absorbed economic shocks that analysts predicted would be fatal and kept fighting. Anyone telling you this particular crisis ends the war is getting ahead of the evidence by a long distance. The evidence shows a system under mounting stress, not a system at the point of failure. What the evidence does show is that the stress is accumulating, not dissipating, and that the mechanisms Russia has available to manage it are increasingly costly in revenue and credibility in the choices they foreclose. One of those mechanisms is the implicit pressure this creates on the civilian population inside Russia. When Moscow gas stations introduce purchase limits, it is not soldiers who wait in line, or at least not only soldiers. It is the ordinary person who drives to work, the small business owner whose delivery truck needs filling, the grandparent who drives to the market. The people in Crimea standing in that line with their 20-liter coupon are not, for the most part, military planners. They are people who made a life on a peninsula that their government told them was secured, permanent, and supplied. And for the people in those 25 Russian regions watching shortages spread to their local stations, the calculation is gradually shifting. not necessarily in ways that translate immediately to political opposition. Russia's domestic information environment makes that extremely difficult to measure from outside. But the material experience of living in a rationing economy has its own political logic, one that does not require a newspaper editorial to make itself felt. The fuel that Russia is burning in Ukraine and is failing to deliver to its own civilians has a cost measured in rubles, in barrels, in coupons. But it also has a cost measured in the ordinary trust between a government and the people it governs. That cost compounds quietly, and it is very difficult to ration. This touches your life more directly than you might expect, even if you are nowhere near Crimea or Moscow. Crude oil markets are globally integrated. When Russian refinery output hits a 17-year low, the global pool of refined products tightens. When Russia bans fuel exports to protect its domestic supply, those volumes disappear from international markets that were counting on them. When Western port crude exports fall 32% in a single month, tanker operators and traders and refiners around the world adjust. That adjustment shows up with some lag and mixed with many other factors in the price at the pump, wherever you fill up. You are not insulated from this. Nobody is. The relationship is not linear, and it is not one-to-one. Oil markets are complex, influenced by OPEC decisions, dollar strength, seasonal demand, and 100 other variables. I am not telling you that the Crimea coupon system directly explains your fuel bill this week. I am telling you that this story is not somewhere else. The supply chains that deliver energy around the world run through the same geography, the same refineries, the same ports that are burning on satellite imagery right now. What happens there does not stay there. So here's what the evidence shows as of June 14, 2020. Ukraine's sustained campaign against Russian fuel infrastructure, refineries, depots, pipelines, and logistics corridors has produced the lowest Russian refinery output in 17 years. It has pushed gasoline rationing into at least 25 Russian regions. It has severed or severely degraded the primary land supply routes into Crimea. It has forced Russia to ban fuel exports, introduce Soviet-era coupon systems, and publicly acknowledge through its own deputy prime minister that oil production is falling. What the evidence does not show is a Russian economic collapse. Crude export revenues remain elevated through a paradox created by the same strikes that are causing the domestic shortage. Russia is adapting, rerouting, managing. Its military continues to operate. The trilemma it faces, civilians versus military versus exports, is real and costly, but it has not yet produced a decisive rupture. The trajectory is clear. The destination is not. Ukraine has found a strategy that is imposing genuine costs, genuine scarcity, and genuine strategic constraints on Russian operations in Crimea and beyond. Russia has found ways to absorb previous shocks. Whether this particular wave of pressure is the one that accumulates past the point of absorption is a question that events, not analysts, will answer. I will not pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that a coupon for 20 liters of gasoline in Sevastopol is not a symbol of a war going normally. It is a symbol of a system being pushed. And systems that are being pushed eventually push back in one direction or another. Here's the question I want to leave you with. We tend to think of wars as being decided by battles, by the artillery shell that lands or misses, the brigade that holds or breaks, the commander who makes the right call under fire. And those things matter enormously. But underneath every battle is a logistics chain. Underneath every logistics chain is an energy system. And underneath every energy system is a set of choices a government made, years before the shooting started, about how to build its economy, how to structure its supply lines, how dependent to let itself become on single corridors, single refineries, single bridges. Russia chose to build the Kerch bridge as the answer to Crimea's vulnerability. It chose to route its military logistics through two highways that are now banned to its own forces. It chose to build an economy so dependent on energy revenues that a 17-year refinery low shows up within weeks as coupons in Moscow and blackouts in Sevastopol. Those were choices. They were made before any of us knew what 2026 would look like. So the question is not just what happens next in this war. The question is, what does a country do when the choices it made in confidence become the vulnerabilities it faces in crisis? And what does the answer to that question tell us about the choices we are making right now in our own economies, our own infrastructure, our own dependencies, the ones that feel permanent and secured right up until the moment they don't? This is Prof. Zhang. I'll see you in the next one.